Welcome to this evening's event, New Publics. It's the fourth event in our programme, Brave New World. Luca Montuori will shortly be introducing our four speakers, and we're delighted to welcome Luca and David Knight, Finn Williams, Marco Provinciali, and welcome back Alison Crawshaw. Over the last few months, we've been exploring the changing role of the architect and also questioning whether younger designers are driven by a renewed social consciousness, a more utopian ideal of what can be done by design. Some of you were here in May for Rainier de Graaf's introductory talk, in which he discussed the end of architecture manifestos and idealism roughly around 1989. And he linked the demise of manifestos with the start of increasing speculative urbanism and globalization. So let's hope that the reverse is true and that the manifestos next door are part of a new era. Our architecture program would not be possible without our sponsors, who are Alford Hall, Monningham Morris, Bennett's Associates, Marcus Trust, Eric Parry Architects, John S. Cohen Foundation, Brian Guinness Charitable Trust, and Jamie Fobert Architects, as well as a special thanks to the Royal College of Art for their support with this event. So our chairman tonight is Luca Montuori, who's an old friend of the BSR, who's extremely well known to all the Romans in our audience. And for our scholars, Luca is Professor of Urban Design at Roma III University and Assessore all'Urbanistica at the Comune di Roma, and he's also the founder and director of the practice Due Tiere. So please welcome Luca.
Thank you everybody. I'm really pleased to introduce this evening this series of conferences, communication, and then the debate that I think it will be really interesting about these four groups. Then we will see the exhibition. I will try to start with a small introduction in Italian. We agreed with Marina just to help even some friends here and just to explain better what we are trying to do tonight. Then I will say some things that I will say even in the second part. Buonasera a tutti. Abbiamo questa sera 4 gruppi o singoli architetti, diciamo 4 tipi diversi di presentazioni che si riferiscono tutti quanti a un atteggiamento interessante nei riguardi dello spazio pubblico all'interno di una visione rinnovata del significato di questo spazio. Sono 4 studi rappresentati qui da David Knight, Alison Crawshaw, Finn Williams e Marco Provinciali, che con approcci diversi ma con tratti a volte simili e opposti. Sono contraddizioni che poi cercheremo di spiegare nella seconda fase, nel dibattito in inglese. L'ordine che mi è stato dato di presentazione sono per primo David Knight, che lavora in uno studio che è chiamato con una sigla che, scusate, la leggo perché DKCM, sono le iniziali delle 2 soci fondatori dello studio, che sono David Knight e Cristina Monteiro, che lavora su un tema che va dalla pianificazione al piccolo edificio come idea di un frammento di un discorso sempre più ampio. Poi abbiamo la presentazione di Alison Crawshaw, che è già stata ospite anche di questa scuola e che ha fatto un egregio e interessantissimo lavoro su Roma, sulle aree ex abusive dei toponimi. Ci siamo anche confrontati su alcune idee interpretative di quello che oggi è un settore della periferia di Roma molto complesso. L'intervento successivo è quello di Finn Williams, che fa parte di una struttura molto interessante per quanto riguarda il lavoro che io sto facendo adesso è quello dell'assessore all'urbanistica, cioè quello dell'interazione tra diciamo, professionalità e pubblica amministrazione, in un dibattito che non finirò. Io diciamo, mi sono messo in discussione rispetto al mio ruolo precedente e quindi abbiamo trovato molti punti di interesse su quello che deve essere il ruolo anche di brillanti, che non è il mio caso ovviamente, architetti, che decidono però di governare le trasformazioni. E da ultimo Marco Provinciali dello studio Supervoid, che ci presenterà una parte del loro lavoro che secondo me in maniera circolare si collega anche in maniera a quello di David Knight, cioè quella dell'idea del frammento come oggetto di una pianificazione, di una narrazione del rapporto con lo spazio pubblico e con il paesaggio. Quindi io, per non rubare altro tempo, perché abbiamo i tempi contingentati, so I want to stall more time, I would like to ask to David to come my place and introduce his work. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. It's really a delight to be here, even though this lectern is slightly too tall for me. I'm speaking first this evening. As you've heard, my name is David Knight. I'm a director of DKCM, an architecture practice based in London and founded in 2012, which I co-direct with Cristina Monteiro. I think it's also useful to start by kind of highlighting that these three practices have been not quite working together for 10 years, but kind of working in each other's orbits and often kind of collaborating through teaching, particularly at the Royal College of Art, and through kind of sharing ideas and indeed, you know, occasionally kind of borrowing each other's ideas wholesale and giving them back to each other. And, you know, it's been an incredibly kind of constructive and powerful time. The other key thing to say really, by way of introduction, before I talk about our work in particular, is that all of our careers, I think it's fair to say that we're roughly the same age, began having studied and you know, all of that sort of thing around about kind of 2008, 2009, and that moment was a really critical one in the history of kind of governance and the public sector and ideas of the public in the UK. Planning is the enemy of enterprise, said our Prime Minister David Cameron in around about 2010, and it was with words like this that the kind of the UK scene entered a period of deregulation, financial austerity in the public sector, and, you know, generally a trying time for the public. So we kind of entered the professions of the built environment in this kind of context. Investment in UK public planning has more than halved over the last decade, such that things like this happen. This is a few years old now, but councils are finding themselves with spectacularly decreased budgets to deliver the same services, and in an increasingly urgent context in terms of housing delivery and things like that. Easy Council, which obviously is a steal from EasyJet, the budget airline, was an attempt by one of the London councils to have various levels of service depending on how much you could pay. The UK's public infrastructure is increasingly reliant on private development, so the financial contributions that private developers make to local authorities as part of their development is increasingly relied upon by the public sector itself in order to function and deliver the infrastructure that is so badly needed. That's a reliance which is problematic in many ways. This is a still from a video of a viability assessment for a major scheme in London a few years ago. These are the financial models that the developer used to argue its financial contributions as part of the scheme. As you can see, they've been quite heavily redacted or edited for public view. So this is the kind of thing that councils and indeed the public crucially are dealing with in the UK is, you know, a blank screen, a blank document. That goes on for many pages, but we didn't embed the video because those always go wrong. So this really is the context for our work. The exhibition is called New Publics, tonight is called New Publics, and I think the kind of unifying thing really that we're all dealing with is a kind of an interest in the public sector and in publicness in the context of the built environment, taking place in the context of an increasingly challenging environment for that notion of public to exist. And I think we're super interested in what might happen tonight in terms of relating our UK experiences and indeed Alison's Italian experiences to the wider Italian context. So this is my bit. Pause for water. In the context that I've just described, one of the things that seemed obvious to me as what I felt then a young practitioner was that in this context of public planning's increased reliance on private money and private investment, perhaps an increased engagement with the public at large, i.e. people, i.e. the popular, might be a way out of that kind of bind. So in 2010, probably foolishly, I started a PhD at the Royal College of Art called Making Planning Popular, which began with this assertion that planning as a public enterprise must become popular. I meant that in terms of liked. It must be something that people engage with at large in society, but also perhaps that it might reside more in the popular domain. That work started actually with a collaboration with Finn of Public Practice, one of the other speakers tonight, which is this book called Subplan, A Guide to Permitted Development. Now, permitted development in the UK is the planning law which defines what you can build without needing a formal planning permission. And in 2008, we chose to look at these rules, which had just changed spectacularly as a result of a kind of general kind of deregulatory impulse on the part of the British government. And we produced this book with a group of AA summer school students. I'm going to take you through a couple of pages by way of context. These are the rules as they stood at the time, back in 2008. As you can probably imagine, they're incredibly opaque and complex. And these are meant to be for use by the everyday public, making decisions about what they might build and how they might expand their homes, for example. And as you can probably see, they're not particularly accessible. So we spent a week with our students transforming this incredibly inaccessible text into something that was accessible. We turned cannots, the whole law is written in cannots, into cans, and all of that complex text became things like you can build on up to half of the plot that is not taken up by the original house. So this is an exercise in interlocution, in language. We then did a series of case studies where we explored how those rules had been written very quickly, and generally it was agreed that they'd been rewritten very badly. And when we translated them, we found a whole series of holes in those laws because they'd never been looked at kind of holistically and indeed very carefully. So we then worked through a series of case studies to examine how those rules might actually play out. So this is an example of a small suburban bungalow in a kind of London suburb. They want to expand their home because they bought a new big television. If they were to follow the rules of the way the rules are intended to be used, I've got a pointer, they would end up with an extension of this scale. If they were to follow the rules as they actually are, as we uncovered them, they could build somewhat more. Simply by building an independent structure, you can build a lot more space. You can get extremely close to the neighbouring, to the original building, whilst remaining an independent structure. We're imagining people jumping between home and cinema room, and indeed exploiting a rather brilliant bit of the planning law, which means that you can build higher if you put a pitched roof on it. Very English, sorry. You can build something which actually can contain a cinema rather than a home cinema. So we made sure that book kind of got around and was seen by a lot of people, and it was quite a successful little project. We kind of were faced with this idea of, were Finn and I going to spend the rest of our lives updating this book as the laws updated themselves? And indeed, they had changed by the time we'd published the book. We were facing a very long career of updating this book. Or could we look for other ways of being that interlocutor between public and planning? So that was the context in which I began the PhD. And I started to look at existing forms of digital mediation between the state and the people. This was this is the planning portal website, a recently privatised information service provided by the government. If you give that a word like extensions, which is probably the single most common word that a householder would add to a planning conversation, you get some useful information, but it doesn't get you very far. If you put that phrase into the website that the government developed after it had sold off half of the planning portal, you get absolutely no information at all about that kind of issue. If you put the same thing into Mumsnet, which is a forum about parenting, you get incredibly rich information. How did you fund your extension? Have you ever had an extension done in winter? The cost of a single versus double story extension. So when I saw this, I got extremely interested in how this kind of information could be made more systemic. This sort of thing is already happening. So in the PhD, I pursued two routes in one go. Design. I tried to design a better platform, and I also undertook a phase of discourse analysis, which I'll talk about first. My contention was that planning hasn't caught up with ubiquitous internet, with the fact that we can kind of access data and indeed opinion incredibly quickly these days and in any context. Nor had it caught up with the more radical end of knowledge dissemination and kind of political transformation. Indeed, the last time public participation in planning was properly discussed by HM government was in 1968. The last time public perceptions of planning were studied holistically by the government was 1995, and indeed, that's all ancient history, certainly pre-ubiquitous internet. Tragic, given that in recent years, very good studies like Social Media in an English Village, which explores the complexities of how knowledge transfer and opinion changes in rural context in English, those sorts of things exist, and planning is lagging hopelessly behind. So, this is the first of a series of manifesto points that are also on the wall with more detail outside. I started to think that recognising what was going on Mumsnet, maybe planning could shift from being about a kind of assumed consensus to being about dissensus and decision-making in the context of dissent, different voices, heterogeneity, argument, agonism, and so on. So I wanted to understand that more. I looked at these four very, very established online communities in the UK. Obviously, some of these are global too. And I started to look at how conversations played out in these spaces, and I learned a few wonderful things that I won't take you through all of them, but there's a few. I asked about language, I asked about the communities that formed around ideas, and indeed about how these things kind of transferred. I'm going to skip that one. Ultimately, these people, the wider public, game the system. Planning is a game the public already plays. We're told by the established professionals, I suppose, that the public kind of receive planning and are allowed to participate in it at key moments. We think that looking at these fora, the public already plays these games and already is incredibly knowledgeable and intuitive. Furthermore, everyone is a planner sometimes. Few people, maybe a few of you in this room, want to be a planner all the time. Very few people want to be a planner all the time. Most people need to be a planner urgently at some point in their lives, whether they're fighting something or advocating for something, small or large. So the 6 videos by my practice that you can see in the show outside are all interviews with lay people who have no background in planning or the built environment at all, and who had had some kind of engagement with planning, either as an activist, someone simply trying to expand their home, and so on. And so we interviewed these guys on Skype, hence the low quality, I should point out, and the kind of informality of it, in order to kind of get their perspective on things. Those people revealed, again, they kind of confirmed this idea that there's a much more kind of lively kind of public discourse around planning than planners at the moment give credit for. However, it also confirmed, in trying to find people to interview, that this community doesn't represent the wider demographic of the UK. The white, middle-aged, near retirement or at retirement man, the thing that I'm increasingly starting to resemble, is the dominant kind of creature in planning discussions, whether in the professions or indeed, more importantly perhaps, in the public. This is a random image from a Greenbelt campaign. There are some women in there, I'm happy to say, but there's no other kind of demographic diversity. That is an appalling reflection on our system. So in parallel to all of this discourse analysis, I started to design a platform. It originally looked like this. The fist, I should say, is available in various colours. It's a question and answer forum. It's about kind of building a kind of knowledge base within the popular domain and about testing how that might build relationships with kind of statutory and official spaces of planning discourse. We workshopped it very heavily with a graphic design collective who are, great visual designers, but didn't know about planning to refine the thing. And we're now working on a beta version, which we're launching any day soon. So we're hoping to intervene through this digital platform in the mechanics of that relationship between the public and planning. Please keep in touch. That's my Twitter handle and the website. And I'll return to that later. I'll hand over to Alison. Thank you. You can just advance it with this, and you can point with this central button.
Hi, I'm Alison Crawshaw. I was a resident here at the British School in 2011. And before coming here to Rome, I worked at a practice in London called MAF, Architecture Art, with David's wife, actually, and partner in his firm. And the project that I worked on there for a long time was a public space called Barking Town Square. And Barking was what's called a Section 106 agreement. So it was the planning game for a large sort of town centre regeneration project. And the Barking hadn't seen any sort of investment for about 50 years when this development was happening, and the main sort of a big part of this project was sort of navigating between the commercial developers who were our clients and the council, who would ultimately be managing the space and taking on the space, and the public that ultimately the space was for. The project won the European Prize for Urban Space. There were 4 sort of key components: a long arcade, an arboretum, a town square, and a folly wall, which are some images here in the arboretum. And the whole project was sort of delivered through something called in the UK, it's called a design-build contract. So there are these quite brutal contracts where the contractors have the right to kind of substitute any specifications. It's quite, hard architects tend to try to avoid them because it's hard to achieve, high quality. But we were really able to achieve kind of bespoke detailing. This is the stairs to the stage, or a copy of the stairs to the town hall, and each one of those slabs was different, and each stone was specifically sourced. So just achieving that sort of level of bespoke detailing within that contract was quite an achievement in the project, and really that was to do with navigating between the developers and the council. So in my proposal to come here as a Rome scholar, I proposed to investigate abusivismo edilicio, which is illegal, converts roughly into a legal building in English. And I had heard that a third of Rome had been built without any planning permission since the war, which I found, an incredible statistic. Okay. I found that a third of Rome had been built without any permission since the war, which I found to be an incredible statistic, and I wanted to know more about the mechanisms which would enable that to happen. And I found that there were two sort of main kind of systems by which illegal building sort of continued. One was the master plan zoning policy. So, for example, in the 63 master plan, they found that there was a lot of informal kind of settlements, a lot of illegal building had happened, and those writing the master plan had to make a decision about what they were going to do about that. So in England, you would probably demolish an illegally built building. In Venezuela, maybe you'd sort of deny that it exists. You'd look at that plan and you'd see a park where the reality is that's completely illegally built up. And in Rome, sorry, I'm probably kind of telling the Italians here that they like history back to themselves, which is very weird, but whatever, we'll see how that goes. But in Rome, the areas of illegal building were acknowledged, and policies were incorporated into the master plan for their recuperation. So that's kind of the sort of the series of plans there. And alongside the sort of this kind of master plan amnesty and condolence system, there's also a legal system which enabled the retrospective legitimization of buildings, which is the condono edilizio, which is a law where you kind of pay a fine for to legitimize the illegal building that you've built. I found that the nature of abusivismo edilizio had changed from something like the sort of Borgata of Pasolini movies, Zone F in the sort of 50s, 60s, through to something much more kind of speculative and opportunistic today. So this is a photograph of buying a house at a supermarket in Palmarola. And I found that the attitude to abusivismo and the way in which the recuperation policies dealt with the problem had changed from something where which is more to do with kind of in the sort of zone in the 60s master plan. It was to do with the kind of state taking responsibility for retrofitting infrastructure, whereas with policies today, the policy specified that the people who had built their houses illegally would get together themselves and sort of retrofit compliance themselves and pay for it and hire an architect to help them to do that. I found that condono edilicios transcended scale and typology, so I found ones that ranged from balconies to water treatment plants to city blocks. These are photographs that I took in the condono edilicio office. So the one left there is a balcony, and the one on the right is the water treatment plant. And I went and visited the toponymy zones. I think I visited most of them, and kind of visited some of these meetings where residents had kind of formed, they're called consortio. They had hired an architect and they were just sort of beginning to develop these neighborhood plans that were to be sort of integrated into the master plan. And I found that the meetings were happening kind of in residents' homes and this is one in a basement beneath a resident's home because there weren't really public spaces and buildings in which that accommodated this type of sort of activity. So, as a resident here, I was, you have to kind of be part of an exhibition here at the school. So having done this research, I had to kind of I wanted to translate it so that it would communicate to an audience that, wasn't necessarily an architecture audience, a planning audience. And I decided I wanted to make a film from a helicopter because that's the way that they used to go out and kind of look for illegal buildings. And so I plotted out this flight path over the toponymy. And I went to the airport and asked for a helicopter, and they gave me one, much to my surprise. So these are kind of some of the references, Le Mani sulla città, Dolce Vita, first aerial footage along the Appia Antica, and my own stills from that film that's playing in the gallery space. And as well as looking at the phenomenon from the sky, I wanted to, be working on the ground in these places. So I had this idea about making an installation on the facade of the British Academy. It was the facade's 100th birthday at that time. It was an idea about, taking that sort of smallest form of condono edilizio, a balcony, and blowing it up on the Lutyens facade. And at one of the toponymy policy meetings, I was fortunate enough to meet Sandro, who had built his home legally and I'd flown over it in a helicopter. And I persuaded him to help me to make the installation on the facade of the British Academy. And so all of the materials for the installation that I'm about to show you pictures of came from Borghesiana, and we worked there. And it was a way of me really sort of, getting to know that neighborhood through working with people there. So this was the installation. The helicopter film was projected above the door. The door usually only opens for royalty. And this sort of portico, this wall, was kind of transformed into a habitable space, and really kind of shifted the relationship between public and private. Because I think when you come up to the British School, this thing really looks like a wall. And it was all kind of clamped to the facade because we couldn't make any holes in the stone or do anything like that. And the project was selected for the Venice Biennale in 2012. But I didn't really just want to make I was given a very prominent position on the front of the central pavilion in the Biennale, the former Italian pavilion. But I didn't really just want to make another installation because that felt quite meaningless to me. I wanted to sort of use the Biennale as a way to kind of come back to Rome and try to kind of, embed the project more here. So I found a site working with Antonella Perrin, who was the architect I showed you in the sort of toponymy, who was responsible for the toponymy in Borghesiana. We found a site in Borghesiana, which was a kind of former held a water tank. And the idea was to sort of renovate this building to make a space for those meetings. For those meetings that I visited in residence homes and basements, and the pieces. Speak to the microphone. Sorry. All the materials from making this building were the ones that were taken to the Biennale in Venice. So like the formwork from doing the concrete there, that was kind of on the facade in Venice. And so the meeting room itself is at once a finished product and a sort of portal, a space where an officially appointed architect and those who have built the city in the absence of architects come together to articulate a vision for the future of the periphery. And I think that that really sums up, one of my manifesto points was embrace the toponymy policy. And I think my interest in that policy was the fact that, it bridged between a strategic vision of the city, the master plan, and, a real kind of ground, bottom-up condition. Finn.
Thank you. Okay. I'm going to try and race through my slides quickly because I'm keen to get into a discussion here from Marco. So if our professional careers have been defined by austerity, this is a process that's really been going on for the last few decades in the UK. If you look at the delivery of homes by different sectors since the Second World War, since 1945, in the UK, around 100,000 homes a year have been delivered by private builders. Housing associations, around 20,000 more recently. But the biggest difference has been made by the public sector, by local authorities, municipalities, building social homes, affordable homes. What's interesting is when you look at the 1970s, when the public sector was building half of all homes, this is against our annual housing target of 300,000 homes at the minute. In 1976, half of all architects in the UK worked in the public sector. Now it's less than 1%. It's 0.2% of all architects in London. And I was aware, having studied architecture coming out into practice, that there were, if there were limited opportunities to practice in the public interest, there's also a limited role for architects in the production of the built environment. So only 6% of new homes in the UK are actually designed by architects, and it felt like an architect's role was serving an increasingly narrow public. So architecture had allowed itself to become a bit of a luxury. So I was interested in shaping places, perhaps through shaping decision-making. And in the manifesto point we have outside, we say there's no point in designing the right answers to the wrong brief. We work upstream to influence the decisions which have the greatest impact on places. And I decided to do that by, looking at what happened upstream in the development process. It felt to me like many of the most important decisions in the built environment were made months, if not years, before an architect normally gets involved. If you take a typical site in London, what's needed on that site, what scale the development is, what uses go on it, where it is, when that development happens, the level of quality of a scheme, who it's for, and how it stands up are arguably all determined before the architect gets the email with the commission, and only then is the architect involved in designing really what's left with just how it looks. And of course, even then, there's still the process of cost engineering that determines how much it costs, and construction, which determines how it's built. So I was interested in swimming upstream. So I decided to make, at that time, what was quite an unusual step, to join the public sector. And I went from working for practices like Publica with David Knight and OMA to working for Croydon Council. This is what 10 years of public service does to you. It's what I looked like back in about 2008. And I suppose I found myself in actually a really privileged position to be able to work on very everyday and ordinary places, but to find ways of making them extraordinary. So we say planning has the power to build better everyday environments for everyone. Rather than creating exceptions to the norm, we work to raise the standards of normality itself. So we worked on some very normal things, high streets in Croydon, and just making them more enjoyable public space. Tram stops, and making them contribute to the sense of kind of public square or space in the city. Vacant sites that hadn't been accessed for 40 years and creating new routes across them, and new entrances to train stations. Looking at market squares in forgotten bits at the edge of Croydon, and working with talented young designers to create real stages for the community to participate in civic life. looked at the buildings, the school buildings that Croydon was commissioning, which at the time I joined looked like this, porter cabins, and worked with off-site manufacturing and modular construction to make them a bit better, to improve the relationship for school children between inside and outside, and commission new school buildings as well. And worked with planning applications that came to us, which weren't all great to start off with, and negotiated hard with commercial developers to try and make them fit better into their surroundings. And whilst they may not be the greatest pieces of architecture you'll ever see, they certainly won't end up in architecture magazines. They're a lot better than what would have happened otherwise. So through doing this practice, through 5 years at Croydon Council and then 4 years at the GLA, my team and we wanted to show that there's a kind of proud history of the public sector driving innovation and excellence, and the state isn't only about maintaining the status quo. And after those 9 years of public practice, I really wanted to find a way of making that happen in other authorities. So working with Pooja Agrawal, also at the GLA, we co-founded a new independent social enterprise, a not-for-profit organisation called Public Practice. And public practice is really a way of getting other designers, architects, urbanists, planners working within local government on those everyday places. Our mission is to improve the quality and equality of everyday places by building the public sector's capacity for proactive planning. And I won't go into this in detail, but this is our theory of change. The main thing we do is we recruit built environment experts at all stages of their careers from a real range of different disciplines, and more often than not, they're practitioners who fall in between these boxes. And we place them within forward-thinking local authorities who are ambitious about changing everyday places for ordinary people. So we've got a really extraordinary, diverse cohort. And we believe that places and their populations are complex and they don't benefit from being simplified. We value the diversity of the places we plan and reflect the diversity of the people we plan for. So this is our first cohort. It started in April last year. They're just coming to the end of their one-year placements within 17 different authorities. They're just going to talk, give a couple of examples of the kind of work they're doing. This relates to a point we've got outside in the manifestos, that every citizen should have a say in how their city changes. Good planning gives a voice to the silent majority by advocating for broader communities, wider geographies, and longer horizons. Now, it's early days in the programme. We're only really 11 months into this first year, but we're already seeing the results that these associates are having in their local areas. So people like Hannah Lambert, regeneration practitioner, is working for Newham Council on their first council-led estate regeneration project in decades, really since the 1970s. But she's doing that very closely with local residents, to the extent that the residents are actually electing representatives from the community who live in the estate to take part in writing the brief and clienting the designers of that project. People like Akil Scaife-Smith, who grew up in Croydon Council, a really talented urban designer, and we placed him back in Croydon, where he's really passionate about working with the community he grew up in on a programme of meanwhile and cultural uses with young people, with different kinds of communities that use that town centre. Hannah Loftus, a very experienced architect who runs her own practice, based outside London, and she's doing a year-long placement in South Cambridgeshire, working on a part-time basis, and actually working on a really interesting series of design codes that are led by local communities. And you might make out the back of that head is actually David's. So David was one of 6 practices that Hannah commissioned to work with these local communities on new design codes for how new development could happen in some quite rural areas. And finally, Jan Ackenhausen. So Jan applied from the Spatial Planning Agency in Brussels, where he was known as Mr. Industry, because he knew so much about industrial intensification and co-location with housing. And we placed him in Old Oakham Park Royal, which is currently the largest industrial estate in Europe, but it's also going to be the location of one of the biggest regeneration projects in Europe as well, with the arrival of 2 major train lines. And he's been working with the local community there to develop the first ever community-led design review panel that we've got in London anyway. So I just kind of wanted to end really by saying that We feel that bureaucracy is not a constraint on creativity. It's a field for creativity in its own right. Even meeting minutes, procurement processes, or legal clauses, we think are opportunities for better design. And we do this through research and development. So within that 1 year placement, 90% of their time is spent working on the ground with local communities. 10% of the time is working collectively on a program of research and development to reflect on their day jobs. And that's really about identifying the kind of issues that they face working within the public sector, but then find new models of practice. And we're just about to publish the first wave of research from that first program in April. We work with a whole range of organisations to do that, including government. And then looking forward, well, currently we just operate around London, anywhere within commuting distance of London, but we're in discussions with government and a number of other local authorities in England about potentially looking to at least 1, perhaps 2 new regions, and even in discussions with other countries about perhaps expanding beyond England, perhaps even to Italy, who knows. So going back to that first diagram, this is the situation we faced. With such an extreme housing crisis and a need to build more homes, our hope is that through public practice we can flip the diagram. Thanks very much.
Good evening. Thanks to Marina for inviting us tonight. So tonight I'm going to tell you about a project we are developing here in Rome. It's located in the outskirts of Rome, and we think it's really interesting. The location of this project is really interesting to understand how the urban realm of Rome develops in its territory. So this is a territorial map which highlights the structure, the urban structure of Rome at a large scale. So you start with the walled city, the ancient city in the middle, from which the so-called consular road depart. And on the outer ring is the ring road, the so-called Grande Raccordo Anulare, which was built in 1951, which links all the consular road. What is interesting to see is that this is the built matter of Rome, that in many cases the built environment developed along the Roman axis, the so-called consular roads. So the city was built on what was once the Agro Romano, and is now a collection of a very untidy collection of fragments, of urban fragments, which lie upon what was once the Agro Romano and then became the idealized vision of the so-called Campagna Romana, where painters and intellectuals from all over Europe used to come since the 17th century. Of course, the Campagna Romana has changed since then, and now what remains of it are the monumental, of course, remains of the tombs and the aqueducts, the monumental presence of the past, but also the more informal presence of day-to-day life and people, basically. So if on one side we have what remains of the Campagna Romana, on the other side we have urbanization, and urbanization has taken different forms in Rome, starting from the most to the least planned. Let's say you have, for example, the big, large-scale social housing complex of the late 20th century, the so-called intensivo, which is high-density planned dwellings. You have the more informal, speculative, deregulated collection of palazzine, the highly unplanned industrial settlements, and then some fragments of what was once a productive agricultural landscape. So as planners, as administrators and architects, what we have to do is to make sense of this complex collection of fragments and try to produce a certain legibility on it. So this is the area we want to talk about. This is the area of the project. It's in between two main consular roads, the Prenestina to the north and the Casilina to the south, at the intersection with the great ring road, the Grande Raccordo Anulare. And this is are the remains of a Roman aqueduct. So the project is part of a bigger redevelopment project of this area, which started with the construction of a new road, which allowed the landowners who are also building the streets to build more commercial space here, and but in a way they also terminate this kind of unorderly development here and create a threshold which in some way preserves the remaining agricultural land to the south of it. We are intervening in what was once the farming complex, which is made of 4 main buildings, and here you see the aqueduct coming in, the new road, and this is the Grande Raccordo Anulare. So it's a very complex area, very interesting, very rich in terms of the stratification of signs. And what we are inserting here is a porch, which is a recurring figure in Roman architecture. And the porch acts both as a threshold, but a porous one, and connects, and also it works with the buildings themselves. This is the area seen from, you can see the aqueduct, and this is the olive plantation leading to the hill with the old farming complex. This is the material state of the complex now. So the project, by inserting this sign, tries to establish a meaningful relationship with the historical, infrastructural structure of the city, the contemporary one, and also the monumental presence of what was once an infrastructure, the aqueduct, and now is a monument. Here you see all the elements of the projects. I will go really fast because I think we don't have much time. This is the plantation plan, and so basically on the inside of this new courtyard we are creating a vegetable garden because one of the main aims of the project is to maintain the agricultural nature, let's say the identity of the place in some way. So it will stay as a vegetable garden, both with a productive and a didactic goal. And this is the plan of the project, where you see this element of the porch, which creates a relationship between the inside space of the buildings and the new space created inside the porch itself. By means of the dislocation of the columns to just one side of the porch, we create an ever-changing relationship and threshold between inside and outside. Of course, this is a recurring figure in Roman architecture. This is an image of the Forum in Pompeii, and you see how by means of a simple gesture in the end, you create a space inside, which is the space where all the public life of the city happened. This is the architectural element. It's quite simple, essential. It's a steel structure, and as I was saying, it's cantilevered, and the pillars are just on one side. And this is an architectural tool to create a stronger relationship between the inside of the space, the building themselves, and the landscape which is framed towards the city. Differently, comparing to the other designs and projects shown tonight, this is a privately funded project on private land. But what is interesting for us, maybe, is that we tried by means of design, by pure architectural means, to embed the maximum grade of, let's say, publicness in it, just by means of design. Thank you.
I'm supposed to make a kind of judgment here. It's not so very strange, this distance. Yeah, thank you. I was wondering, I was on a banquet, but it didn't happen because we as Rome municipality, we brought a couple of banquets, public banquets for the exhibition. We'll see later. We have just a few minutes to go deeper in some part of the discussion. I would say the presentation has been very interesting and sometimes also different from the idea I had looking at the websites of the 4 offices. In fact, trying to find a common ground about discussion, I can say that I found more points that are sometimes in contradiction in practice. That is the most interesting thing, I think, in this time. I think that we can go through a formal approach to the idea of discipline of architecture and planning. And for example, I saw even some projects from David in the website that go deeper in the formal approach, but always using theory as a foundation of the activity of design. So using projects as a fragment of a huge narrative about what the city is, like we saw even Supervoid project, going deeper in some process approach to the planning, looking at more in the idea of how can I influence decision, and maybe that the work of public practice and Finn explained. And of course, his work fascinates me because actually I'm involved in public, let's say, in public offices. So, what would I ask you? Because we saw these two kind of aims, these two kind of consciousness about what today is public space, what is the city, what is planning, and how we can go through an operative approach and a kind of new, I would say, utopic pragmatism. This is very strange to put these two words together, but that's what we see today in practice, not only in your work, but in many, many offices today approaching to public space and to the city. Pragmatism, because all these offices want to change really the city, but utopic because these even small changes, working in toponymy, working in a garden, working in a pavilion, working in a bus stop, are part of a huge theory about what the city is. I don't know if I get something of the aim of your work, but I think that this is very interesting. So I have to leave contradictions in our work, in your work, of course, and I think that this is highly operative on one side and trying to approach to a huge vision of the city. This is this double level of the work of the 4 offices that is very different ways, I have to say, but this find me the more interesting part of the work. I don't know if I would go deep in 3 minutes, each of you, to add something to what you already said. I can start from the last. So
yeah, what I find interesting about your question is the idea of contradictions. I mean, and also this underlying idea of what the city is. I think the city is the place of contradictions, and it should stay so. The idea that we can resolve or hide or not tackle contradictions is clearly failed. So, yeah, I think what we can do as architects is to highlight them by means of design, as I was trying to say in the presentation. And also I want to add, since you're part of the administration of the city, and what I'm quite jealous about your work is that we are in desperate need for public clients as architects. No? So I think, yeah, because of course that's also what we studied. I mean, it was.
You're right, but I think that something that David showed in the beginning, then we can go deeper in this political problem. That something that showed. Sorry, I take again I lead the discussion. But what David said that in a moment in 2008 in London, something changed in rules, shifting from planning to buildings. That is what happened in Rome in 2009. And in my opinion, this is part of what happened in 2007, and I mean about the crisis and what happened to the banks. So why planning is boring? Because planning is looking at public interests. Planning takes a long time. Planning means decision, not always popular. And building, instead, is everybody can do whatever he wants in his house. And this is what happened in Rome, shifting from planning to building, so in private buildings. And this is leads to some documents made even by Europe about how to help economy and, I would say, banks. Because to build a new addiction, you have to ask to a bank some monies, and even in Toponi, I would say, then we had a discussion a couple of days ago, no? You ask for some monies to a bank, so this is the idea that building would restart economy. So, sorry, that's why you don't have public clients, because exactly what happened in 2007, we are still in this kind of, I think, way of looking at what the city is, and that's why I decided, and what also Finn said, we have to shift the view and to look exactly at what, I really love what you say, shaping places means shaping decision making, not only have budget for fantastic buildings. Sorry.
Well, I think that, that's strange using microphone. One of our manifestos that is out there actually says that planning shouldn't be dichotomous, so it shouldn't be, about contradictions. And, I think that the way that, what interested me about the toponymy policy, as I said, was that it was kind of bridging between strategic vision for the city and, a very kind of local action. And I think that, what we're all used to doing in our work is, knowing when to bring sort of the London plan to the table in order to, deliver results in the projects that we're working on. I think we're just sort of constantly navigating between strategic vision for the city and the sort of design work on the ground. But I don't think I don't see that as a contradiction. I see that as, just being how architects should work and how planners should work. They should be thinking at different scales and, knowing when the two should influence each other. That's what I think about questions.
Yeah, I think that question of scale is very interesting for me, because of course, having studied it as an architect, you hear phrases like, is it Ernesto Rogers who say, architecture designs everything from the spoon to the city. But it felt like going into practice, the options available professionally were more about fiddling with cutlery than meanwhile it was the commercial interests, it was the banks that were really shaping the city. And it felt like the decisions that really do make the biggest difference, it's almost like the more important the decision, the less design or spatial intelligence goes into making it, right? So whilst you need good designers at every stage of the process, right down to the doorknob, there was a real absence of design intelligence at those earlier stages and further upstream, certainly in the UK. It's not to say there aren't great people working in authorities, but there were nowhere near enough of them. Not just after 10 years of austerity, but after 40 years of the withdrawal of the state. So public practice was a way of seeing not just formal planning, but also the act of commissioning, of being a good client as a form of design. The way we get budgets as a form of design, and seeing our role actually as creating the conditions for really talented designers to come through. So, a lot of Muff's work, who Alison used to work for, with Christina, who co-founded DKCM, has been commissioned by the Mayor of London. Similarly, quite a lot of David's work has been commissioned by the public sector in one form or another, or other local authorities. And that wasn't necessarily about big budgets. It was about us being quite entrepreneurial, about finding ways of getting small amounts of money from different sources, bidding for things, negotiating for money off private developers, and saying, well, maybe in this context, maybe it's not about making big plans. Maybe it's just about being radically pragmatic and making a few small things happen that can then be the seeds of wider change.
Yeah, I think my practice has done a lot of commissioned projects for London boroughs, public authorities across the UK. So we've been in parallel to this big, long, enduring PhD, which I finally finished. There's been a whole series of commissioned work, and indeed Christina's been doing that for a lot longer than me too. And we've ended up in ultimately not really doing architecture commissions as such, but being given very complex briefs which involve negotiation within the brief. It's not just us coming up with it, but it's in the brief to be reconciling private needs, public needs as in the local authority, and very importantly to us, the public needs of the wider community. That's often paid lip service to in a brief, even if it's kind of intentional and ambitious in that way, and we tend to push that quite a lot further. So in our kind of pragmatic work, let's say commissioned work, we constantly see, I think, a very productive push and pull tension between all of those interests. And I think personally, if I see a failing in kind of past models of publicness, I see it in kind of denying that complexity, I suppose, in the kind of, I don't know, certainly at the birth of 20th century planning in Britain, there were whole kind of class assumptions, hegemonic assumptions about who would plan and for whom and in what way. I certainly don't seek a return to those sorts of structures. We need to recognise that push and pull. And so that's something we just see time and time again in different formulations, in different projects. And I guess we're concerned with finding ways of doing those projects, certainly, but also stepping outside of those projects and helping to make that playing field not less complex, but more fair.
Just to underline that for me, contradiction is a positive problem. I'm in a generation of complexity and contradiction. So sometimes simplicity, but that's what I want to underline, is that sometimes in the past we used to see pragmatism opposed to theoretical approach. And now we see that this is part of the same way to research, the way to act in public space. And this means a new political approach to architecture and planning. Instead of using, and I steal some word again from Finn, big budget for small needs, we have small budgets for big needs. That's what Alison made in the toponymy, where we have a completely illegal city that needs roads, that needs pipes to bring water. They don't have water sometimes. And the decision to bring an aesthetical problem even, because of course it's not just a place to meet, no? It's also sometimes that is a sign that can recognize, and I knew very well the project for the public space in London because I love it. And so this is what exactly I would focus, that even the small works that once we would not consider. In Italy we live the dichotomy between profession and culture. And this led us in a disaster, let's say. So the heroes of culture and the everyday's life of profession. So this new, let's say new, but yes, in this pragmatism, I think is new, and is typical from a generation that is even not mine, that's maybe more yours, and is strongly connected for me in this idea of crisis, and this idea of how we can act with a political approach to which are the needs of a society that is, let's say, we are all from Europe, more or less, and what is welfare, what is public, why public is important in planning, no? And that's why I find that even the small fragments part of a theory is very interesting in your work. I don't know if you want to, there are some questions from the public. We don't have time. If someone want to add something, because I interrupt you, sorry.
This idea... This idea of the fragments of a larger picture that come together because of some common sentiment, in a way, attitude towards the public realm is of course interesting. But then, yeah, it comes from a common background of, let's say, theoretical background, as you were saying. But I think it also meets. And maybe that's where public practice is also crucial, in not just providing what the public needs, but also provoking the public to actually, you are creating, let's say, a need for good planning by showing that it can be done, simply. So it's as simple as that. And I think the problem often in here is that not that things don't get done, but they are done poorly and with scarce design skills. And it's as simple as this.
I think certainly when we came out of architectural education, very few people would have considered going into the public sector as a potential route. But those practitioners, particularly when they're working for larger commercial offices, feel that the results of their professional careers are actually exacerbating many of the problems they face themselves. The inability to buy a home, being areas of London being gentrified and therefore being forced out of, their own neighbourhood by their own work, or seeing this inequality of the city increase around them because they're raising prices through designing yet more penthouses. And I think it's that frustration that's driving a lot of people to consider where the realms of architectural practice could stretch to. Just now I think the tables have turned quite considerably. Our last call for applications, we had 220 people going for just 20 places. An extraordinary quality of practitioners, not just young people as well, people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who are working in private practice but feel like they want to give something back. So I'm incredibly hopeful that if we show that if we create the right kind of jobs within the public sector, create the kind of agency and the license to be creative within bureaucracy, then we can invest quite a lot more design skills in these kind of systemic questions.
Yeah, I'd like to reply briefly to the kind of the idea of the kind of small scale. And obviously, in my presentation, which showed the book that we did together, Finn and I, obviously that's about, incremental change. It's about tiny things, house extensions. Obviously, we did some that were slightly larger than the norm, although that's humble in context of the toponymy. And then when looking at the kind of public discourse around planning that's happening online in the UK and of course elsewhere, in a way that's almost a sort of smallest architectural gesture it's possible to imagine, because it's 2 people or 10 people talking about possibly doing an extension. It's like the sort of tiniest gesture. It's not even building, it's discussion. And I think I was really nervous looking at that I might find a kind of, what we call a kind of NIMBY culture of just sort of not much import in these discussions. I was really hoping that I would be wrong, but I was slightly scared that I might just find discussion and inertia and nothing ever happening. And it was really incredible and very kind of edifying to find that in these tiny spaces, sort of insignificant spaces, apparently, incredible ingenuity, incredible kind of joy, design skill actually. Like we can talk about professional design skill and I think it's of enormous value, but also there's incredible skill and ingenuity in the public at large that the public sector could build relationships with. So I think that something of this sort of pragmatism is about a kind of a new respect for the small in a way, but to not argue that kind of small is enough and small change is okay in itself, but to argue that there might be within it the seeds of larger social movements.
Alison, you want to add something? We still have 5 minutes. I can go. Okay. No. Marina asked me to lead the discussion until 7:30. Until 7:30. Another thing is about the attitude about the relation with the idea itself of public space. I would like to shift a little bit, because what public space is today changed completely. We are in Rome, the idea of piazza is still, public space is a piazza, and I don't even want to imagine me coming back at 6 o'clock having a drink in a piazza before getting home. So what public space is very interesting in your research, and we were discussing on Monday evening about staircases with Marco and Benjamin, and even with the idea of banquets. So the idea of public space as a place where you really stay, or just a place where to meet. What is the idea you have today about working on public space, in this idea where public and private are really strange? I would like to use used by public more than public, that comes quite differently, even of course in Toponi, where public space do not exist, and maybe there is also a reason why do not exist.
Sorry, is the question sort of how what's that really?
Public space in a place where public space that was born against public space. Toponymy, that's from Rome, sorry. Okay. Just for people from who is not from Rome, toponymy is the completely illegal areas of the city where houses are born from the center, let's say from the living room through the outside. Then you have the rooms, then the porch, then the garden, then the fence, and then nothing. No street, no piazza, no ways where you can walk. So having the idea to make a public space in a part of a city that was born without the idea of public, only with the idea of private space, the most private you have, that is the living room, the TV addiction, no? Maybe there are swimming pools in toponymy, private swimming pools sometimes, private tennis courts, sometimes I saw in Dragona, not in Borghesiana, but no street, for example.
It was really clear to me actually that I didn't want to, the Venice thing happened, didn't just want to do an installation, I wanted to do something in Borghesiana, but I really didn't want to impose any idea of what publicness was, like a bus stop or a bench. Just, it seemed kind of completely irrelevant. Whereas making a space for the toponymy policy. So what
what the meeting room was a space where the consortio would be together and they would be discussing and generating their own publicness, their own public spaces. So, you know, there was a very specific program for the meeting room, which was to do with, you know, Antonella using it and a space where you would generate a neighbourhood plan. And I think that's, you know, that's what public space is. It's a space that something should kind of grow from, like businesses should grow from, or some kind of exchange. So yeah, that's yeah. There was a sort of a real kind of specificity to the program there. It's about generating new forms of publicness, I suppose.
Oh, goodness me. An anecdote occurred to me, which is, so Finn and I met working at General Public Agency, one of the bosses of which, Claire Cumberledge, was a curator, and I remember her saying kind of endlessly, in a good way, that kind of good public space, or maybe public space itself, is not just the kind of presence of space that is allocated for the public, it's a space that is contested by the public. So if there's a kind of, the most glorious pavement on the world, if there isn't some kind of battle taking place over its ownership, whether that's like a chair placed where someone else would rather there wasn't a chair, or a literal battle, or just, you know, activity competing as it always does, as we know from how we experience the places of the city or the suburb or the countryside. And so we sort of look for those contestations, I suppose, when proposing public space projects. And I should say that a lot of our work, commissioned work, is public realm projects, in not quite in the extreme situations of the toponymy, but in more like Barkingtown Square, where you have kind of, you know, apparent public space that's actually on private land. It's opposite, quite a lot of kind of ambiguities. And I think, again, like the ambiguity and the complexity is something that we kind of see quite a lot of joy and potential in, and that's a sort of a site of agency.
Is the question what public space is for? Like,
I was wondering, about the idea of the project you made about staircases models, using the city, even like, as how architectural elements that are part of a narrative, again, in your research, that are part of, we were discussing a few days ago about a project they have that I find fantastic, to make models about benches and parts of architectonic staircases and so on as places where you stay. Maybe they were not born as public space but used as. So it's a kind of mix even here, because strategies and architecture and tactics in the public space so going on in Europe.
Yeah, I think so. What we proposed to have this seating element, which were one-to-one scale models of sections of public stairs found across the city of Rome. What I find is interesting about this element, for instance, of the stair, is that it resists, in a way, a very specific use. So it always allows for, let's say, otherness to happen. It's like not something that you can really appropriate, and so as opposed to flatness and sameness, I think public realm is what allows and provokes you to encounter otherness. Yeah, and so that's.
And even a question for. Yeah, is there? Just last question for. There are traps here. No, continuing on this idea of public space, what I found very interesting in the research of Finn is the idea that public space is completely related not to the idea of a public space as a piazza where the conflict happens, but an idea of public space, of places where you live daily, for example, waiting for the bus, flowing in the city, because I think that moving in the city today is part of the main part of the public space is the right to move yourself in the city, that in Rome, of course, is sometimes not so easy. So looking at this small, maybe thinking to even to the idea of playgrounds of Aldo Van Eyck, so just changing a small corner, not making a piazza, that helps you to make it happen. So like a small tactical, let's say, element, to use it, can be part again of a huge strategy of looking at the way you move inside the city, and you have different places that are public spaces. I don't know if it is correct.
Yeah, I think the conditions that we're all working with in terms of the assumptions about what creates public space are far more complex, because open space in London is not necessarily publicly owned anymore, partly because of the reliance on the private sector to create any new public space. Much of what we've seen built in the last decade is what's called, it's privately owned public space, or POPs. So it's often managed by private developers, and that comes with certain restrictions or code. And similarly, if we look at the way we move around the city, I think the same thing, really worryingly, is happening to public transport. Public space doesn't stop with the bench under you or the pavement around you. It's also now what you access through your phone and the social life you live through your phone, or the way you use your phone to get around the city. So I don't know if City Mapper has arrived in Rome, but in London that's the way that an app you use to find how you get around. Now, City Mapper used Transport for London's data to find out where to get the best bus or tube. But what's most shocking to me and kind of both terrifying and fascinating is that they've identified the gaps in public transport provision by analysing that data, and they're starting to run private transport to fill in the gap. So private buses that are cheaper than the tube, and of course the profits don't go to the public sector or the public purse, they go to City Mapper. So they're using public data, and I think data is now part of the public realm as well, to basically secure private profit. So for me, the role of planners doesn't stop at the ownership of a piece of a piazza. It really goes down to the code of the city and the way we use it, the digital code as well, and those are the kind of fronts we need planners to be battling on now, to ensure that the kind of public space we all live in, whether virtual or real, is still genuinely accessible and genuinely equal as well.
Just to add a word, because there is a fantastic project made by the David office about the Deliveroo project I saw in the website now. So it's connected to this idea of public space accessible not only by a place, real place, but it's all accessible by the telephone for people that works in the city. And so if you don't know, there's a fantastic project you can see in the website of David about Deliveroo networks of places where you can find services for people that works as public parts. Huh?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to add something, but then we have to from the back.
Okay, anyone searching on the website, it's called Ryder Gardens. It was a project about recognising that services like Deliveroo and Uber Eats, which obviously they're not. Yeah, absolutely, they're not public things. They're things grafted onto the kind of existing public provision, and indeed traditional forms of private provision, taxis and so on. We started to notice. Christina and I live quite close to one of the main routes that these riders take around the city, the kind of inner ring road, which is quite central. It's where the congestion charging zone starts. We started to spot these riders gathering in particular corners. Because they were kind of, and they're known as Ryder Gardens, like they're kind of spots where it sort of makes sense to park your bike because there's a Chinese takeaway there and another takeaway over there. And there's a kind of triangulation point. So they're a fascinating thing because they're an emergent public space. Like no one really designed that group of people to be there, but they're there because of the mechanics of Uber and Deliveroo. We weren't particularly interested in kind of helping Uber and Deliveroo, but we were interested in helping those riders that have actually, often really kind of precarious employment situations with those companies, and they're not particularly catered to by our existing public spaces. So we were looking at in a way also using that as a kind of as an excuse to improve public spaces in key places on a really crowded road. So they were gardens for riders, but more importantly, they were gardens for everyone that riders just happened to be parked in already. So there's a kind of, again, it's that pragmatism, isn't it?
This is very important because in Italy we have this idea of public space dedicated to old people or to children. So everyone who is more than 15 and less than 65 doesn't have right to public space. And instead of looking how do you live the city, even we deliver new uses, new works, it's very important to imagine new ways to act in public space. So if there is any question from the public. Andrea.
Inglese o in italiano?
Non so se devo rispondere io o anche in italiano.
No, io sento l'urgenza di fare una domanda all'assessore. Scusi, non è una domanda troppo provocatoria, però voglio dire, esiste una differenza enorme tra l'esperienza inglese e l'esperienza italiana, perché noi ovviamente pensiamo che lo spazio pubblico sia uno spazio dove esiste una libertà di usare anche uno spazio che è un spazio, diciamo, non particolarmente architettonico, ma è uno spazio della città. Purtroppo noi in Italia non abbiamo questa libertà perché non esiste proprio la possibilità delle volte di attraversare le strisce pedonali o di camminare sul marciapiede. Questo, voglio dire, è un primo passo verso uno spazio pubblico che va comunque affrontato, perché secondo me la politica, cioè l'uomo politico si confronta con la città nel momento in cui esce per strada e si confronta con le altre persone. Nel momento in cui non ci sta questa possibilità, purtroppo per noi è difficile pensare a una idea di spazio pubblico che abbia anche un senso che vada oltre la libertà, ecco, delle persone di usare quello che esiste, diciamo. Quindi ecco, diciamo, è in qualche modo una provocazione, ma perché vorrei che questo fosse il primo passo per poi prospettare.
I would answer in English, so it would be easier to not answer to your question. Of course. I think you are right. And what happened, I was just saying what David pointed out with his presentation, is that in a moment of crisis, the idea of planning, that is exactly the idea of what public influence in the transformation of the city was completely closed. In Rome, in Italy, in Lazio, we have the piano casa, 2009. The idea of Berlusconi was you have new children and you need a new room. You don't have to make all these boring documents or to wait for planning. You just do it. He said you never have to ask the permission. Then at least we arrived to a strange idea of... we arrived from the small room. Well, it happened before Christmas. We approved a practice of piano casa for 4,500 inhabitants, just with one paper permission, 4,000, in a place where planning didn't need, imagine, to have one house. So per gli italiani, quando con il piano casa abbiamo approvato un quartiere intero a Muratella, in un'area dove dovevano esserci degli uffici secondo la pianificazione, per trasformarlo in un quartiere per 4.500 abitanti, dove era il centro direzionale all'Italia. So this shift from planning to building, the idea of dalla pianificazione all'edilizia proprio, that in Rome is even formalized, where you have one building is where I work for planning and another building is where I work for building. So it's completely in two different buildings, because planning is something for theorists in the idea of nowadays, and building is what moves economy. Everywhere you can read is, the economy is going wrong, so we have to restart from, in Italian, edilizia, neither architettura, edilizia. So this is very important because it's in the last 12 years, the idea that private will work better than public in the cities, completely. Yes, but in the last 12, but yes, from the 90s, but from the 90s until 15 years ago, the municipality of Rome completely destroyed its capacity to make projects. We don't have architects, brilliant architects, that can make a project of a school. Maybe it's correct we don't make projects, but at least we have to define the behavior, what do we need when we make the project of a school. That is not a school, from manual junk like that. I don't know if I answered, but...
No, io non ho bisogno di No, only a witness from the generation that refused planning, no? Because my generation refused planning. We fell in love with chaos, with congestion. We love to consider the shopping mall a public space. We did conferences in shopping mall, in airports. Why did we refuse planning? First of all, because in Southern Europe, planning failed, no? Or there wouldn't be toponymy if planning worked. And also because the old idea of planning was the task was the city, was not the community, was the form of the cities. This is what we grow up with. So this is the main difference today, and I like your interventions because you are redefining somehow this. So we need to redefine this idea of planning, and it's interesting that it comes from London, a city that, from our point of view, never had any planning. So, so it's a complete switch, and quite interesting. So I think it's a very good discussion to open. The second step for me is that we may do something more. No, it's to be. I mean, half of my generation went into the public sector. No, there were big laws in the 70s, 80s, including many architects in the public institutions. But I think probably we should say, maybe in countries like Italy, or think of Spain, take care of the public presence in the process of giving a place to live to people. Is not simply only building houses. The problem in Italy, there are millions of empty houses. In Spain, there are more millions of empty houses. There are millions of empty factories. There are millions of empty office buildings. So maybe we can not simply think that the architect in the public sector is designing a politically correct building, but maybe we can find alternative strategies, I think, today. Because we don't want to go back to this dictatorship of the form, of the formal. We want to go back to an idea of a sensibility and commitment. And I mean, when Marina spoke to me the first time about this program, and she was using the word politics, I said, okay, palle, no? You know, architects, when architects and artists and architects in this time, when they don't know what to do, they use the word politics. No, I think it's very clear. But today I heard things about policies, and I think this is a very good thing. So I think our discussion should be, if we discuss politics, maybe it's better we go in the streets and fight. If we discuss policies, I think this is a good platform for us today. So thank you.
So you saved the program according to people.
Oh, thanks. Hello. I have a question for everybody who wants to answer. So there's. I appreciated this idea of utopian pragmatism to define our work. And my question is, how do you work with, and I want to come back to the concept of public space, and how do you work with the community? Because sometimes there's this idea that the community is made by not all the people can cross a public space, so the public space is something where you can have the unexpected, but it pertains to the children or to the owners of dog. In Rome, there's this family of public too, we have seen today, or this idea of elderness. So sometimes when we design for a community or for publics, we have to first break this idea that democracy is providing to the community their own space. For instance, in Rome, there are a lot of neighborhoods that have promoted transformation of public spaces for community, and the first thing they did is enclosing the garden or enclosing the public space, controlling the lock, and control who can enter, who cannot. Mandrione near the office and so on. So, and we were discussing, when I was a student, we were discussing a lot of time that Rome in the last 20 years has enclosed most of the public space of the city. So how do you work in these needs of participation, democracy, in having decision, and building up the culture of public space? Because it's... Okay, ciao.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question, and it goes back to how we need to change planning to prevent repeating many of the mistakes of the past. At the same time as I'm not actually playing into that idea of planning as somehow a barrier or part of something we need to deregulate. So in 2010, roughly the same time that David Cameron was saying planners are the enemies of enterprise, his government introduced a localist agenda, which was all about empowering communities to have more of a say over their local neighbourhood, and actually bypassing local government in many cases. So they gave communities the power to plan neighbourhood plans. And one of the really interesting things that happened is that, of course, communities are by their very nature quite exclusive. The stronger the community, arguably, is the more clearly they can say who's in it and who's out. And those strong communities that tended to be the ones that had the money, that had the spare time on their hands, that already had the expertise, were the first to draw up these neighbourhood plans. And they weren't necessarily considering the impact on their neighbours, the impact on the wider city, the impact on future generations. So for me, the role of the planner has got to be about drawing our sense of what a community is to be wider. So making our sense of we to be as wide as possible. At the same time as pegging out our sense of what is now to be as long-term as possible, and making the kind of geography of our scale of thinking go beyond the red line boundary. So making our sense of here to be as big as possible. And whilst we need to listen to and work with those, the kind of very close definitions of we, here and now, as planners we need to be having that conversation, but also be saying, well, what about the future generations? What about the people the other side in the toponymy? What about and what about the impact you might be having on the rest of the country?
To add to that briefly, I think well, certainly if you look at the kind of history of ideas of participation and community engagement, things like that in the UK context, but not only in the UK context, they inevitably come out as kind of highly codified moments of sort of, you know, at this point in a particular process, we're going to find out what the community wants. Then that will be written up as a series of bullet points, and that will then inform the project again in kind of highly codified and sort of very understood by the professionals terms. I think our experience of just doing that kind of work and that kind of commission over many years, you know, firstly the notion of kind of the community is an erroneous one. Just to kind of counter that point about the kind of, you know, communities being very exclusive, certainly, but also there are diverse communities in one place. Certainly in the UK context, there are voices that are typically dominant in community structures, and we've found ourselves having to work extremely hard when faced with a kind of public engagement commission, let's say, or wanting to do one as part of a project, which we tend to do, to find ways of boosting voices that are typically the quiet ones in the context of a particular series of communities, you know, agents around a particular place. So I think the key difference really is to recognise kind of communities rather than community. I think a lot of the work that I looked at in the PhD was about how, participation as understood by planners is permanently kind of framed by planners. So we let communities participate in our thing. We design the structure of that participation and so on. And I think that also feels kind of out of date, really. And I think if you make a very precise door for people to pass through as an engagement process, you're going to get the same answers all the time, and so it's, to go back to design, it's about changing the shape of the door and making more doors.
And a lot of that, so just to continue, is about involving people earlier upstream. So not just asking people whether they like the look of a building or not, but actually helping them to, giving them empowering them to actually shape the rules of the bureaucracy, to make the bureaucracy legible, which is a lot of what our work is about, and then see that as part of a discussion that the public can be involved in. So I think done right, in that sense, one of the other manifesto points we have as public practice is that done right, bureaucracy can be beautiful in that sense, and it can be the foundations of equality, because it's that thing that gives you a common set of rules that everyone is playing to. And I think just thinking about then what implications that has for public space, or what public space could be, if you see bureaucracy almost as part of public space now, it's the same way as data is. At least it should be. Of course, we're here in Rome, and we were taught to draw public space in the form of nollie maps. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at what a nollie map would be of public space in its true complexity nowadays, and see that as part of our realm as designers.
I would ask you to move us in the room and to continue the discussion in front of the panels, maybe. So thank you to everybody. I think the discussion is